I'm going to start this video by running the full footage of my Model 3 successfully navigating a very tricky traffic pattern. Construction on an overpass has meant that the traffic pattern is changing very frequently through this area. This particular time, the lanes shift left, then right, complete with concrete barriers along the right side. My 2018 dual motor Model 3 was upgraded to hardware 3 and was running software 2020.32.3 at the time. Both of my hands are on the wheel for safety, but the blue steering wheel and lane lines on the screen show that all of the steering and speed were controlled by autopilot. I realize that what you're seeing might appear unremarkable, even if you are a user of autopilot yourself, but that alone shows just how incredible Tesla's software is. We've come to expect this performance out of autopilot. However, what you just saw is actually an incredible example of the power of Tesla's artificial intelligence approach to autonomous driving. Not only did autopilot successfully navigate a construction zone that I've seen confuse human drivers, it arguably did so better than even the human drivers who are familiar with it. Let's watch that again, but this time I'm going to stop the video to point out various challenges that autopilot had to contend with in this temporary traffic pattern that weren't there before construction began. Tesla's AI approach allows autopilot to correctly prioritize conflicting information about the bounds of this lane. It does not need the markings themselves to be done correctly, and that is what really amazes me about how autopilot performed through this traffic pattern. Before even entering the intersection, we can see how faded the lane markings are on the left, and they're completely non-existent on the right. Autopilot keeps a normal distance from the lane markings on the left instead of centering itself between the markings and the right edge of the lane. This kept autopilot from having to make a sudden correction to avoid hitting the concrete barrier. At this point, look at how many different forms of lane markings autopilot is having to sort through. You still have the current white dotted lane line painted on the left. You have a lane line straight up the middle that was only partially scraped off the road, which itself creates a high contrast line that autopilot occasionally uses to determine the edge of a lane. However, autopilot correctly prioritizes the markings and smoothly centers itself without drama. It doesn't take long at all for autopilot to encounter yet another mess of markings. None of the conflicting information is reflected in the smooth path autopilot chooses, even as a very clear yellow lane line appears across and then centered in the new lane. It's reinforced by high contrast between two types of pavement, which under other circumstances, autopilot would use to define the lane's edge. The very clear solid white line on the right certainly helps at this point, but this still demonstrates that the AI is correctly prioritizing lane markings the way a human driver should. Speaking of humans, the construction workers up on the hill are rendered in the on-screen animation, showing that autopilot is factoring them into its pathfinding decision. They disappear from the screen as soon as autopilot determines they are no longer a factor. As the lane shifts right, autopilot has to deal with confusing contrasts and old lane markings yet again. Yet again, autopilot stays smoothly centered in the correct lane. It does slow down, however, as you can see in the difference between the speedometer and the 35 mph set speed. This might be more conservative than a human driver, but it didn't slow down enough to create a safety issue for the trailing vehicle. Though several other manufacturers have lane keeping abilities, I think GM Super Cruise makes a good contrast to Tesla's AI approach with autopilot. Super Cruise is a true hands-free driver assist system that, when engaged, handles all steering, throttle, and braking for an attentive driver. An in-cabin camera determines whether or not a driver's eyes are open and looking at the road ahead, even through sunglasses. If the system is satisfied that the driver is paying attention, it will allow the driver to keep his or her hands completely off the steering wheel. Various stages of warnings alert the driver to take over when necessary. Super Cruise is currently heavily dependent on pre-map lanes. According to Cadillac's website, these maps are updated once every quarter, and even then, only if you have an active OnStar subscription that costs $35 per month after your third year of ownership. In fact, you can't even activate Super Cruise on the section of road where Tesla's autopilot just hit a grand slam. While Super Cruise does use cameras and other sensors to ensure the vehicle is centered in its lane, this is only as a backup to its onboard LiDAR maps and GPS. If the road you're on doesn't exist in the LiDAR map or GPS is being wonky, Super Cruise cannot be activated. But more relevant to what you just saw Tesla Autopilot accomplish, if what the cameras see doesn't match the map data, Super Cruise is disabled. In fact, GM specifically states that Super Cruise does not navigate construction zones. Tesla Autopilot instead uses 8 cameras, 12 ultrasonic sensors, and forward-looking radar to map the road in real time. Yes, it does use GPS and digital maps for navigation purposes, but neither is used to determine what is called drivable space, where places your vehicle can safely go next, given its current position and momentum.
I say momentum because clearly autopilot factors in more than just speed. Momentum factors in the mass of the vehicle and determining how hard it is to stop or turn or do both at the same time. As human drivers, we think about momentum all the time, even if we don't think of it in those terms. If we weren't thinking about momentum, we wouldn't successfully stop a car right at the intersection without blowing right through a red light or hitting the car stopped in front of us. We wouldn't successfully navigate a curve without going off the side of the road. We wouldn't successfully merge with traffic when we enter a highway. Drivable space is any space that I could safely occupy with my momentum, which is going to carry the car from space to space depending upon the inputs of the steering wheel, of the accelerator, of the brakes. We don't have to do any calculations as humans because where our intuition fails us, we can always look back at the painted lines, and we often get suggestions for safe speeds around curves and other interesting intersections. Actually, Tesla is rolling out an update right now that I don't have yet that starts to read speed limit signs. I don't know if it handles the recommended speeds that you'll see in places where they think you should drive more slowly than the speed limit, but hopefully I'll know soon enough. Clearly, autopilot doesn't need any of that though. It successfully handled 75 minutes of very sharp curves on the Blue Ridge Parkway for me on a much earlier version of autopilot than I'm running right now. It factored in my Model 3's momentum into what it needed to do to stay in my lane. But human drivers don't even need lane lines to know where they're supposed to be on a 2-lane road. Neither will autopilot eventually, but we don't even need to wait to be able to see it working this out in real time. You can see the gray lines here indicating the correct bounds of this lane, even though there isn't anything painted on the road. Of course, I can't engage autopilot or auto steer just yet, but I know I will be able to eventually. And it will be because autopilot does not need maps or even GPS to know where it needs to drive. I've used autopilot when GPS couldn't place it on the map. So clearly autopilot doesn't need to know where it is on a map to know that it's in safe drivable space. But that's because Tesla's approach is to teach its system the rules of the road and how to apply them the same way a human driver does based upon what it can see. This is what allows autopilot to succeed in a construction zone like you just saw when other semi-autonomous driving systems can't even get close. If you're interested in getting a Tesla for yourself and seeing what autopilot is all about, be sure to use my Tesla Owners referral link when you do. It'll get you free supercharging. Full details on the Tesla Owners referral program can be found at the link itself. Be sure to subscribe so you can see my next videos on the advances that we're experiencing with Tesla Autopilot. I really appreciate you watching The Tech of Tech, and I hope to see you next time.